I'm Deborah Van Amerongen. I'm with the firm Nixon Peabody here in New York City, and I'm delighted to have been asked by the network to moderate this panel discussion. We are very fortunate to have three DC practitioners here with us today. We appreciate each of them making the time and effort to travel up here to share their perspectives on what is going on in Washington and what we as the supportive housing community can be doing to best protect our interests in the coming months and perhaps years. So I'll do quick introductions of the panel. We're going to go through issues related to the HUD budget and other budget items first, and then we're going to switch over to some conversation about tax reform. So again, we're delighted to have this great panel with us. Directly to my left, your right, is Sarah Mickelson. She is the Director of Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. She has been in that position since June of 2016. She had previously worked with Enterprise Community Partners as a senior analyst, and in that role, she focused on building congressional support for federal affordable housing and community development appropriations. To Sarah's left, again, your right, is Emily Kadick. Emily is the Director of Public Policy at Enterprise, where she leads policy and advocacy related to the low-income housing tax credit and rental assistance programs. She also helps to lead the coalition known as A Call to Invest in Our Neighborhoods, the ACTION campaign, which you'll be hearing some more about later in the presentation. That ACTION campaign is a nationwide coalition of more than 2,000 organizations advocating on behalf of the housing credit. And finally, last but certainly not least, Steve Berg, who is Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. He specializes in employment, economic development, and human services, and the crossover between those issues and housing. Prior to joining the Alliance, he was at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, where he worked on state-level welfare reform and employment. So, again, great panel, people who have a lot of experience, are around the halls of Congress and in DC knowing about what's going on, and we're delighted to have them with us. So let's start with the Russia inquiry. What's going on there? So I don't know, we might rather talk about that than about what's going on in the budget.
Absolutely.
But we'll skip over that today, as intriguing as it is. So we're going to start, and I'll ask Steve and Sarah perhaps to weigh in. The spending plan for the remainder of the 2017 fiscal year was recently adopted, and we'd like to hear a little bit from you. These are some of the broad numbers. You'll see up on the screen, what we try to do is put together a couple of slides that cover the topics that we're talking about, so it's not a PowerPoint presentation per se, but there should be some information up there that we hope you find helpful that sheds light on the information that we're discussing up here on stage. So what impact will this spending plan have on housing programs and any provisions that you would highlight in that?
Okay, well, I can start. Is this mic working okay?
Yeah.
Yes. So the fiscal 2017 budget was just finally passed by Congress. You know, we're like, what, 7, almost 8 months into into fiscal 2017, but they finally passed their budget. It was a sort of a normal, I think a decent budget on housing issues. We're happy about an increase in the HUD homeless assistance line item. The sort of normal levels of funding for a lot of the HUD programs. We're a little concerned about the funding for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I think for reasons that aren't quite clear to me, I think they started out the year thinking we want to make sure we put enough money in there to keep that program funded, to keep the number of vouchers at its current level. But I think in the end, they did not succeed in doing that. I think it's going to be short funded. The voucher program is going to be short funded in fiscal 2017. If people hear from housing authorities, some of you are probably dealing with that already. So that's an item of concern and something to watch out for.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll add is that it really sets the stage for FY18. So from my perspective, at least, the FY17 budget was as good as we were going to get. There was the best possible outcome for affordable housing advocates. But it set the stage for 18, and the reason why I say that is because the reason why you saw such a delay was because the new president was coming in. He wanted to put his mark on the budget, but all said and done, he came in a little too late by the time he actually put pen to paper and put forward what he wanted out of the bill. A lot of that had to do with funding for the wall and border security. He ended up not getting any of that. And so it was a big kind of crushing defeat for Republicans and for the White House, and that makes them all the more focused on FY18 and making sure that they can get some victories out of it.
So moving on to 2018. Sarah, this budget proposal has been released. Can you give an overview of what's included and how it would impact federal housing programs?
Yeah, well, before we get into the president's budget, it's really important to take a step back and look at where funding has been over the last several years. So in 2011, Congress passed a bill that said, basically it set up a structure to try to find deficit reduction savings. And it said, if we can't find at least $1 trillion in savings, we're going to put in place these really onerous, arbitrary spending caps on both defense programs and domestic programs. The idea was that those spending caps would be so bad that it would create and manufacture a crisis that Congress would have to deal with and push them into doing something on the deficit. That didn't happen. And so we've been living with these spending caps since 2011. Congress and President Obama came up with short-term agreements every 2 years to provide some limited relief equally for defense programs and non-defense programs. But this time in FY18, we're seeing those spending caps come back into place.
So this is what's known typically as sequestration.
Sequestration.
So it really hasn't gone away ever.
What makes the president's budget even worse is that he goes far beyond those spending caps. So instead of treating defense programs and non-defense programs equally, he wants to increase spending for defense programs by $54 billion. That means everything else has to get cut, and that includes the HUD budget. So we see about a 15% cut to HUD this year in the president's budget, or $7.5 billion. It eliminates the Home Investment Partnerships Program and the Community Development Block Grant Program. Those are two really important flexible sources of financing that your state and cities use to address community development needs and affordable housing needs. It would dramatically cut funding for public housing repairs by 2/3. It would also deeply cut the voucher program. So we're looking at about 250,000 families nationwide, about 26,000 families in New York alone that would lose their access to housing assistance. And because these families are very low income, many on a fixed income, it would mean that they're at a very high risk of either seeing evictions or homelessness. So the budget is terrible. It's as bad as it could be. The one good aspect of it is that everyone knows that it's dead on arrival. So both Republicans and Democrats have said that they want nothing to do with this bill. It's actually a really easy thing if you were to ask them, do you support the president's budget? Easily, they would all say that they don't support it, so that's not the right question to ask your members of Congress. The question is, does this move the goalpost so much that when Congress and the White House are negotiating, that now cuts that are half as bad seem reasonable? And we can't let that happen. So our focus has been on the need to lift the spending caps equally for defense programs and non-defense programs. We don't want to be caught up in using their goalposts. We want to set our own. And so I think that's something that you guys can have a lot of leverage in when it comes to talking to your members of Congress.
Yeah, and Steve, I'd like you to weigh in on that same question. Like, how important is the Trump budget in the overall budget discussions going into the fall this year?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I go back and forth on this virtually every day. I mean, I think it's very important to make a strong statement that this budget is just wrong. And it's not so much about, I think we're tending to focus not so much on the individual amounts of money, although there's, some of those are pretty horrifying. But I think talking too much about the amounts of money in the Trump budget then plays into the idea that, well, if you only cut half as much, then that's okay, which, as Sarah said, we definitely don't want. But I think that people say that a budget is a statement of values, and the values here are just wrong values from our point of view. I mean, the values of this budget are that poor people have to solve their own problems, wealthy people don't have any obligation to the country they live in that's helped them become wealthy. Those are values that we have to clearly reject. But then, once clearly rejecting them, then we have to move on and talk to Congress about what they do need to be doing. It's not so much stop the Trump budget as we've got 500,000 homeless people still on the street, 100,000 more becoming homeless every month. We need to deal effectively with these problems, and we can do. I believe we can do that in a bipartisan way. Even though the Republicans are the majority, Republicans have been the majority in Congress for most of the last 20 years, and yet we've accomplished a lot. And I think we've worked very hard to make housing and homelessness a bipartisan issue. I think this is a year where all that work is going to pay some benefits if we keep their feet to the fire.
Yep. And we're absolutely going to talk some about advocacy as we go forward. So, Sarah, we talked about that the budget for FY17 just got adopted. For people who maybe aren't as familiar with the process, I mean, we haven't had the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st of each year. We haven't had a budget in place by October 1st in my recollection anyway. So what impacts how the process plays out from here, and whether we actually have a budget bill or can go under continuing resolutions for the remainder, so for some portion of the fiscal year?
Well, you're right to say that we haven't really seen budgets on time for a long time, and even though Republicans control Congress and the White House, and they say they want to return to regular order, that's going to be really difficult for them to do. In part, it has nothing to do with budget, and has to do with tax issues and healthcare reform. There's a procedure that they have. It's called a budget reconciliation, but essentially it lets them pass a tax bill or the healthcare bill with just 51 votes. So that's very appealing to Republicans in Congress. They want to be able to use that tool, but that is tied up with the appropriations process. And so the longer it takes them to work on a health care bill to get it through reconciliation on the FY17 bill, the more that pushes back the conversation about FY18. So things are really up in the air in terms of timing. I think it's very unlikely that we'll see a budget on time again this year. In terms of timing for FY18, we've heard some rumors that maybe the House will move really quickly, maybe even before the August recess. That seems hard to do, but they've been setting very ambitious goals for themselves of when they can get it done. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to have to see some negotiation between Senate Democrats and the rest of Congress and the White House. And that's because, unlike the tax reform bill, which we'll get to later, and unlike health care reform, they still need 60 votes on any appropriations bill. And that gives a lot of leverage to Senate Democrats to negotiate. The question is, when do Republicans want to have these negotiations take place? What other business do they want to take care of beforehand? I think that they're going to want to address health care and tax reform before or at the same time as appropriations. So my guess is we'll see something in the fall.
Steve, back to you. Given all these cuts that are on the table and the uphill battle that we have, is it realistic to talk about increases in homeless assistance during this time?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, right now we're looking at a budget situation where if they have, as Sarah was saying, they have an overall cap on spending, and if they keep that cap, then it's going to be hard to talk about increases. But I don't really think it's feasible to keep those caps. Those caps apply to defense spending as well as non-defense. There is a lot of push, including by the new administration, to increase defense spending, and there's a very good chance that the only way that can get the 60 votes in the Senate is if they increase non-defense spending at the same time. That's what happened 2 years ago with the Republican-controlled Congress, and we ended up having a pretty decent appropriations year. So that's not for sure. It's going to take a lot of lobbying and a lot of advocacy and a lot of making sure that people in Congress understand that the kinds of appropriations bills they can write using these lower caps that they're dealing with now are not acceptable, to get them to the point where they'll raise the overall spending level.
And I'll say, like, the only way that we can lift those spending caps are if there are enough Democrats and moderate Republicans hearing from constituents about what the need is. And the need exists outside of whatever Congress passes in terms of appropriations. So it is definitely important that we not negotiate against ourselves by asking for less than what's actually needed to solve the problem.
Right. So Emily, you've been sitting there patiently. We appreciate it. And Emily's going to be talking a lot more about some of the tax reform topics as well. But, one thing I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about is, there's turnover in Congress continually, a lot of new members of Congress coming in. So how do we best educate policymakers that may have little or no experience about issues around affordable housing? And how do you see the affordable housing industry mobilizing to do that type of education?
Sure. So it really can't be understated how many policymakers who don't have an understanding of affordable housing issues have either are new to Congress, maybe affordable housing isn't a top issue in their state or district, or even beyond the members themselves. There's just so much staff turnover in DC right now. So obviously the administration, we're having to staff up a whole new administration here, all the agencies, all the economic councils, they're pulling heavily from the Hill. So there's really just a tremendous shuffle going on right now. And what that means is, at least for the first time in at least several years, for those of you who've been on the Hill, you've probably observed just how many staffers, when you kind of start the meeting by saying, so, what do you know about affordable housing? Or, in my case, I'm usually up there talking about the low-income housing tax credit. So what do you know about the housing credit? And getting over and over, why don't you start at the beginning? And, the end of last year, when you're dealing with many tax staffers who've been in their position for many years, and the low-income housing tax credit's one of the 10 largest corporate tax expenditures, they may not be experts on it, they may not understand all the nuances of the legislation we're pushing, but they've heard of it, and there's really just a lot of people there now who do not know what this program is, and I assume the same is on the budget side, where they just don't know all of the different HUD programs. Maybe they know what HUD does, they can name a few. But if you're starting to talk about home versus CDBG versus PBR, they just don't know the differences in these programs. In terms of, well, before we get into kind of how to educate them, I will say one thing I've observed, and I'll be interested in hearing whether my other DC veterans on this panel have observed the same thing, but I think that there's actually a little bit of relief on the part of some staff members when you come in to talk to them about something that is bipartisan with all of the other things going on. I think a lot of staffers who came to DC to work on whether it was tax reform or health care, and are seeing a lot of obstacles to getting their agenda enacted. When you come in to say, here are some programs that have a 30-year history of bipartisan support, or here's programs that are having really positive impacts in your district and aren't really thought of as Republican or Democrat issues, I think that there's actually a lot of interest in both finding things that are proactive that they can sign on to, and in talking about some of these issues that aren't as divisive. They're not the things that their members are getting attacked about at town halls, and so they kind of they don't bristle talking about affordable housing the way that they may about some other issues that other advocates are going in to talk to them about. That said, I think the work that we do in DC is not what really closes the deal with any new members. I think those of us who are in the DC offices of our organizations, we can go in and talk through staffers on kind of how some of these bills work and do some of the explanations, but the ways that members really become convinced of the merits of these programs is hearing from constituents. And to take it a step beyond that, it's really seeing examples of these programs in their states and districts firsthand. Representative Teaberry, for example, a Republican from Ohio who's been the longtime champion of the low-income housing tax credit, almost every time he talks about the program, he brings up examples of properties in his district which clearly stick with him a lot more than any of the statistics any of us could share with him in a meeting. So I know here in New York, you already have a very persuaded congressional delegation. I think you don't have to tell them that affordable housing is an issue here. You don't have to tell them to support affordable housing programs, but there are some members in New York who still haven't, signed on to these, and so there's still work to be done. And even beyond that, just making sure at the staff level everyone understands things. Maybe Senator Schumer completely gets it, but he's got new staff coming on, and making sure that with every single person who works for every single one of your members, that they all get these issues too. To the second part of Deborah's question about how advocates are mobilizing in light of this new climate, I've been really thrilled to see not just a slight increase, but an exponential increase in the number of advocates who are entering the fold to speak up on behalf of affordable housing issues. The Action Campaign, which you mentioned, which is the now 2,000 strong member coalition in support of the low-income housing tax credit, had 1,300 members on November 8th, and so 700 of those have joined, just in the past few months. And I've been spending a lot of my time on the phone with whether it's developers or advocates or whomever, saying, I've never reached out to my member of Congress, where do I start? And for those of us who do advocacy, that's kind of the best call you can get. And I think, in previous years, we had our Cantwell-Hatch legislation to expand the housing credit was introduced last year. It was really exciting, but I think a lot of people kind of outside of DC had this sense of, well, when was the last time Congress actually did anything? Why should I, divert from my day job to, spend time advocating when nothing moves? I think people realize that this year may be slower than it might have looked a few months ago, but there is a much higher possibility of things moving. And while there are some serious threats to the programs that we work on, there is a potential for some improvements as well. So it's great to see people mobilizing, and especially I would actually say most of my calls are coming from New York, people saying, what can we do? How can we kind of reach across the aisle? We've already got everyone on board here, and I think that energy is great. So encourage you all to reach out to your partners upstate and red states, and give them all the tools that you've used to convince all of your members here.
Yeah. And Sarah, I don't know if you can see the slide that's up. It's this, what you could do to advocate for affordable housing. You were nice enough to put this together. So you want to just walk through some of the suggestions for how to actually engage in advocacy?
Yes, some of them are things that Emily mentioned, so I'll focus on the others. But one is we have a sign-on letter with about 3,500 organizations on it calling for Congress to lift the spending caps and fully fund affordable housing programs. So if you're not already signed on to that, you should click on that link and go there, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the slides afterwards. The other thing that you can do is start reaching out to the broader public about the importance of housing and bringing more advocates into your own fold. We're planning a housing day of action with a number of national organizations. All of us are going to be reaching out to our local membership to have an event on the same day, on the 29th of July. The idea is that organizations across the country can be holding events on the same day to their capacity. So somebody could have a rally in one city, and another city they could have a letter writing campaign, really whatever suits your needs. But the idea is to break through the noise and to make sure that the needs of housing needs are elevated. So we'd love to work with you guys on that too. And then the next are just a couple of things that are bread and butter, things that really work well in terms of advocating with members of Congress, meeting with them when they're in their district. So members of Congress should be on recess over July 4th and for the entire month of August. This is a really great time for you to meet with them while they're here, invite people who are benefiting from affordable housing programs. Another option is for them to go and visit a development that's been built with the low-income housing tax credit or other resources. It's really important for them to see tangible outcomes of where this money is going. A lot of times we talk about programs with section numbers and budget line items. For them to be able to have something tangible to point to and remember is really important. And that's usually the best way to turn somebody who is supportive of affordable housing into a much leading champion. So we want to be able to elevate people from and their levels of engagement in that way.
Mm-hmm. Great. Emily, we didn't talk, in case you couldn't figure it out, we went over these questions ahead of time. One thing we didn't talk about, but I do think it's worth mentioning, we've seen, and again, we're going to talk a little bit more about tax reform and the action campaign a little bit later in the presentation, but we've seen the tax credit community really come together, and that includes everybody from, low-income advocates, advocates for residents, to the investors, sort of the whole spectrum. I feel like perhaps on the appropriation side of things, we haven't had as much of a strong coalition yet, and I guess I'm wondering, and from any of the three of you, ideas about how to do some more of that, how, to bring together the broad, diverse coalition of people who are impacted by affordable housing investments, and also any thoughts about specifically messaging, because, I hear from some people like, well, some of these members don't really so much, care what you're going to say about the residents, but you can talk to them about economic development and the impact of job creation. So I open it up to any of the three of you, sort of thoughts about how to get some more focus and coalition building around this, and also what some of the most effective messages are.
I'll let the other two speak to engaging the appropriations advocates, but I wanted to share a couple observations of why I think the housing credit industry jumped. So, the HUD budget, there are a lot of serious threats to the entire budget and to many programs, but that's a battle that happens every year in the appropriations process. Whereas with the housing credit, everyone's been talking about tax reform for many years, but this is the first year in many where it looked like it might actually happen, and we know that the stated goals from both Congress and the administration are to eliminate nearly every tax expenditure. So I think everyone in the housing credit industry woke up on November 9th, and as part of processing the results was, oh, there are these plans that we sort of ignored last year are now actually going to go somewhere. And then the follow-up to that was that the housing credit market's already been hit just in advance of tax reform. So while the FY17 budget was on balance pretty good, and we're gearing up for potential cuts, but there haven't actually been any to appropriations programs yet at any great scale, the housing credit market's already had this hidden pricing from the uncertainty and investors starting to look ahead towards a lower corporate tax rate. So the practitioners in the program are kind of already feeling this, and I think that gives them more of a sense of urgency for advocacy, because there are already impacts without even Congress having, even as they kick the can, the impacts are already occurring.
Yeah. Steve, any thoughts?
Well, I'd just like to mention one additional thing. You're at a Supportive Housing Network of New York conference, and let me tell you, the Supportive Housing Network of New York does a great job of not only working on state issues, but also working on the federal issues. We work with them a lot to make sure the right kind of appeals are being made at the right time, that people are focusing on, what's hot in Congress. So I would say, take advantage of that. If you're in New York and want to know how to be as effective as you possibly can with the amount of time that you're going to be able to spend, trying to get your members of Congress on board, pay attention to those advocacy emails from Supportive Housing Network of New York, because they will guide you in the right way and make your work more effective.
Great.
Yeah.
And Sarah, you had some other advocacy resources. Maybe if you could just mention some of those while they're up there.
Sure. A part of our advocacy resources are really aimed at trying to do exactly what you're asking about. How do we reach out to new audiences? And I think that housing advocates alone aren't really going to be able to move the dial where it needs to go. If we want to really solve homelessness and housing poverty, we have to be reaching out to new partners, and that includes people who work in the education space, people who are healthcare providers, other people from other sectors who see the role that housing plays in their ability to get their jobs done or to be as successful as they would like to be. So part of what we've been doing in trying to build those relationships is partly putting together this report that we have a link to here that pulls together the latest research that shows the link between housing and health outcomes, upward mobility, financial security, better education outcomes for children, higher earnings as adults. Lots of the data that's out there that can help us make an argument tailored to what members of Congress are interested in. So part of knowing the right messaging is knowing who you're speaking with. And so maybe with a Republican office, maybe you focus more on the economic mobility piece of why housing is important, or the job creation aspect of it. Maybe with other offices, you would focus on the health outcomes if that's what that particular member of Congress is interested in. And so we're hoping that this report is a resource that you can use to tailor your arguments a little bit closer to what those members of Congress want. And along with it, we have over 100 success stories that you can print off and bring with you to your meetings, talking points, sample tweets, op-eds that you could use, tweak, add things to it, and try to place in your local newspapers. So there's a lot of good resources there that you can use to start getting the message out further.
Yeah, and I would say one thing that we have heard Secretary Carson hasn't said a lot yet about where he wants to take the agency, but one thing he has talked about is connections between health and housing. So we're hopeful that that's something, that message will resonate, and we'll be able to at least protect the resource we have and advocate for more. We're going to transition into some other issues still related to budget and appropriations, or spending, I should say, but before we move off the housing specific, I thought I'd open it up, see if anybody has any questions, any topics we haven't covered. Yes, David?
Yeah. On the 2018 budget, just for a minute, I was in Washington 2 weeks ago talking to some lobbyists who were focusing on the need to actually pass a budget this year because of a budget that has come from the president with zero in many categories. So, and we're used to the continuing resolution, and the interpretation is that you can say that the lowest budget rules in a continuing resolution. Lowest budget number of rules would kill some programs.
Right, so the question's about a continuing resolution, which is essentially a way that Congress can avoid passing a budget, so it carries over, for the most part, numbers from the previous year. For housing programs, that doesn't work. And the reason for that is because 85% of HUD's budget is tied up in rental assistance. Rental assistance responds to the private market. So when you see rents increasing in your communities, so does the cost of rental assistance. So just year after year, you need about a 3% or so inflationary increase to cover the costs, just to maintain the same number of people in their housing. So having a continuing resolution and carrying forward the same numbers from last year is not workable for housing programs unless we see deep cuts to the home program like we have already over the last several years, deeper cuts to CDBG, for example. That gets back to the point of us really weighing in with members of Congress and telling them that they have to lift the spending caps. There's no other way to fully fund housing programs, or not as easy to do, without lifting the spending caps.
Any other questions? Yes, hi. Hi, Rachel.
So in the president's budget, there was a proposal to increase tenant share of rent from 30% of adjusted income to 35% of gross, and eliminate utility allowances. So we just looked at some 202 residents who could see a 44% increase for one tenant on what they would be paying every month in rent. So I spoke with some members of the New York delegation, and they thought that there might be some appetite for this in a House bill. So I'm just wondering if you're hearing the same thing and how concerned you are over this policy.
I mean, I can start with that. I mean, Congress, there are people in Congress who've been talking about this sort of thing for years and years and years, and it's never really gone anywhere. I think when push comes to shove, the idea that the tenants in a lot of these HUD-supported properties, that the answer to underfunding housing, affordable housing, is to make the tenants in these properties pay more, is just so counterintuitive that even, well, I won't say it that way. Let's just say that
even fiscally conservative.
a lot of people in Congress get that that's not going to really be the answer to whatever problem there is. I'm always worried about this coming up again. I'd love to see I would encourage you, if you went to the trouble to flesh out some scenarios of how this would affect people, make those public, spread them far and wide. Get them to as many members of Congress as possible, because I think it's important that people understand the practical impact of this.
And anybody who doesn't know, this is Rachel Fee from the New York Housing Conference, who, along with her colleagues at the National Housing Conference, do great advocacy work as well. So.
Yeah, we brought up the conference are out to meet with the tenants, and we're doing short videos, and we're hoping to have them out soon and replicate them in other states. But I just feel like in this environment, the
Yeah.
you know, any kind of increased rent burden for tenants is, you know, not one that's going to be sustainable in the long term.
I think one thing that's especially concerning about these proposals in the context of this budget is there is, I think, a more good faith debate to be had. So, for example, PHAs that have the moving to work designation can, you know, increase tenant rent, and usually the agencies that have experimented with this, their goal is so that they can eventually serve more tenants. So here we're seeing increasing tenant rent while decreasing the number of tenants served and also cutting all of the community development programs. So you can almost think of it like increasing rent for tenants so that you can offset, you know, more defense spending, which is just a completely different conversation. But to Steve's point, we met recently with the House Financial Services Committee, who are, you know, some of the ones who've been talking about maybe not these policies specifically. They've been talking about things like time limits, work requirements, just all of these kind of, you know, all the things that fall into the same philosophical bucket. And they said it was on their list for 2017, but it was number 6 or 7 after things like housing finance reform, flood insurance, gutting the CFPB. So, you know, just kind of looking at the pace of how things are going right now, it does seem like there's still interest, and I think the president's budget will give them some fuel to maybe try to take up some things. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some, you know, hearings on it, but in terms of actually getting anything like that through this year, it does seem like kind of a stretch.
And I just want to jump in. I take a more cautious approach to it. I think everything that Emily and Steve have said is definitely true in terms of the timeline. They want to get to it, but they have other priorities ahead of it. What I worry about most is them adding provisions onto an appropriations bill, which they could easily do. And if it ends up being a big omnibus bill like we saw for FY17 with lots of bills in it, with lots of programs, the question will be, does this rise to the level where Democrats, where it's on their radar and they're willing to push back on it? And in order for them to have it on their radar, they need advocates like you guys talking about what impact this would have in their communities and why it's bad policy. And so without that, you can easily see something being added to an appropriations bill and kind of just getting slipped through. So I don't know if there'll be a big bill, standalone bill on its own, but I'd be very, very worried that something like this could be added on. And of course, all of these provisions directly impact the people who are the least able to absorb these costs by definition, by raising minimum rents, by taking away people's utility reimbursements. It's really the wrong approach, and they need to know that. And then I'd say for the messaging piece around this, you know, that's something that we've talked to Republican offices about. You know, we want people to have living wages that they can live on and be successful with, and but this is not the right approach to it. 94% of residents in HUD housing either are already working at low wages, are seniors, are people with disabilities, or are caring for somebody in their household who has a disability or who's a young child. You know, so creating a new kind of punishing system to take away people's housing assistance for that 6% is really the wrong strategy. If they really want to focus on building opportunities for people, we need to be talking about how do we get people with the education that they need and the training that they need to get, you know, good paying jobs.
Great. Okay, we're going to transition over to a couple of other topics. So, Emily, starting with you, President Trump has released an initial outline of his administration's infrastructure proposal, which does not include housing. But HUD Secretary Carson has said numerous times that housing will be included in the infrastructure plan. Are we still expecting housing to be part of infrastructure, and what can we do to increase the likelihood that it is?
There's certainly great interest in potential infrastructure legislation, since I think not just affordable housing, but many industries see this as maybe the one chance of something moving that's going to have a whole lot of new money that may or may not be paid for. So, you know, when we're seeing these potential cuts in the budget, I think there's a lot of hope for, you know, how some of it could potentially be offset in an infrastructure bill. I think that we as housing advocates have to do everything we can to make sure if there is an infrastructure bill that comes together, which there's a lot of questions about since congressional Republicans are not particularly interested in it, but if a bill comes together, we want to make sure housing is in it. However, whatever comes up in an infrastructure bill is in no way a replacement for cuts in the budget, which would be much more difficult to, you know, increase that funding again in future years. I think that Secretary Carson does believe housing should be part of the infrastructure package. It's unclear how much he is at the table or who is at the table right now, when we might see a more detailed plan. I think Senator Schumer's plan that he put out, which did include increases for numerous affordable housing programs, including the housing credit, was a really smart way to kind of say, okay, President Trump, you want to do an infrastructure plan that costs $1 trillion, here's plan. And, you know, kind of banking on the fact that Trump is not necessarily an ideologue about those things, and, you know, depending how things play out, may at some point want to work with the Democrats on something. But there are so many other bigger items on the agenda, it's hard to see how or when infrastructure would advance. So, you know, I think it's an important point to be making in all of our advocacy, but shouldn't be considered kind of our replacement for making sure these programs are fully funded through the budget and tax reform.
It's also possible that whatever, if something does happen in infrastructure, that it is not necessarily a spending bill, but it's more of a tax cut package. So it's, you know, again, it's hard to think about how they would, none of us want to replace the housing programs, but even if that were the argument that it's taking care of some of the cuts to the housing programs, they don't equate really.
Right, and if it is more of a tax cut type package, there could be opportunities for programs like the low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit, to say we've already got, you know, these credits that are encouraging development that wouldn't occur otherwise. But it would certainly make it a lot harder for some of the programs that I think people are seeking increases for in an infrastructure bill, like CDBG, home, public housing, some of these other kind of bricks and mortar options that aren't as easily fit into a tax cut package.
Yeah. Steve, so you wanted to also talk a bit, and we've got a couple of slides on this, on Medicaid and what some of the administration's proposals are, and what can people in the homeless services community do on such a big issue like Medicaid with so many players involved in the conversation.
Right, so it's interesting to just, the other day we were going through a bunch of stuff at the office, and I came across a work plan for the Alliance like from 15 years ago. And right at the top of the list of things we needed to work on was some answer to the problem of how to pay for treatment and supportive services for people in supportive housing. And 15 years later, we still struggle with that. But an important thing, and I think everybody here probably knows this, that there has been really great progress in the last couple of years at making the Medicaid program work better for people in supportive housing. The Medicaid agency at the federal level came out with guidance about how to use Medicaid to pay for a whole range of housing-related services, as people know. More and more states are applying for waivers to their Medicaid policies in order to do that and do other things, some even to the point of I hesitate to say because it's complicated and people in the healthcare world get squirrely when you say we're going to use Medicaid to pay rent on housing, but and people in New York know better than anybody else. But some of that is starting to happen, which is as it should be. I mean, the Medicaid program is what we have to pay for health care for poor people. It's 50 years old. It's had a lot of popularity over the years. It had very bipartisan support right from the beginning. The healthcare legislation that has been that the House passed and that the Senate is working on, a lot of the centerpiece of that is they're going to cut a lot of money out of Medicaid. They're going to get rid of the Medicaid expansion, which was in the Obama Health Care Act, the Affordable Care Act. The Medicaid expansion has been a major way that people experiencing chronic homelessness have been able to be covered by the Medicaid program. But the proposal is to go way beyond that and do block granting or capping proposals that would reduce spending in Medicaid overall well below what it was before the CARE Act even passed. We're quite concerned about this as a matter of how we deal with homeless people who have severe medical problems, particularly behavioral health problems. So this is something we've been actively opposing cuts to Medicaid and think that it's an important thing. And right now, it's like, it's something the Senate is working on very hard and very much could go either way.
Right, and then outside of whatever ends up happening with healthcare reform, the administration also has some things in their FY18 proposal.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what's in there?
Yeah, so then beyond the healthcare bill that has already been out there, the administration came out with it in its budget was more big cuts in the Medicaid program. So the House healthcare bill has 800 and some billion dollars worth of cuts to Medicaid over 10 years, and then the administration's budget added another 600 and some billion dollars. So that's almost $1.5 trillion in cuts over 10 years. I don't get to talk about trillions of dollars very much, but it's like, oh, it's really very concerning and very problematic. And this is again, it's like what I talked about before with this budget. It's not so much the number of dollars as it is just the values. This is a big move to say that the federal government's role in helping poor people afford the basic necessities of life, that this is the people who've taken over the budget process in the Trump administration want to move away from that. Want to undo 50 years worth of commitment to low-income people. It's an all-hands-on-deck moment. The healthcare is very tied into work on supportive housing, so it's not this particular room full of people has got a lot of more parochial reasons to be concerned about it. But for anybody who's concerned about low-income people, this is a huge moment, really, in our history. Great.
I'm not suggesting Steve can answer any questions about Medicaid, but any questions about what he just talked about? Sarah, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about, so Speaker Ryan has put forward a plan to reform really fundamentally the way the federal government addresses many issues, including tax reform, health care, and poverty. If that plan were enacted, how would you see it impacting housing programs?
Well, it's a little hard to say that because it's not very detailed. We don't know a lot of what they mean by the language that they put in their A Better Way plan. But some of the things are hinted at in the budget that we talked about earlier. Some of the things are different. The things that we're most concerned about in the Better Way plan would be something like work requirements and time limits. That would be really burdensome and punitive to low-income people. We have seen this before when it came to welfare reform. We know what happens, and what you end up seeing is that while some people might get lifted out of poverty, a lot more people are pushed deeper and deeper into it. And so the more that we can use this budget to talk about the provisions that Rachel brought up earlier and to point to why that would be problematic, the better it is to get the train moving if there is a bill in the fall on welfare reform changes to housing programs. I will say that you're seeing the same sort of language being added to the Medicaid program as in the president's budget, and other programs like food stamps and other things that we consider the safety net programs. It's definitely on the radar of many conservative Republicans. They want to see this language added essentially to many, many programs, including housing programs, but they can't do that without a statute. And so we're hoping that this is something that they don't have time to get to right now, and that when they do get to it, we're all organized enough to be able to push back on it.
Great. And we're keeping our fingers crossed the Senate Dems keep their ability to stay together on these issues. Steve, aside from the appropriations budget, what other opportunities are there to improve federal support for housing?
Well, thanks. We're not sure of that, but there's some things to watch, I think. I think you said the infrastructure bill already. There's discussion about whether housing should be in there. We think it makes a lot of sense, and there would be a lot of support for that. If they get to tax reform, that could go either way. Again, the worst case scenario in tax reform is that it hurt some of the existing sort of tax-related help that people doing affordable housing get, the low-income housing tax credit. If they sort of decide, they're just going to get rid of all the tax expenditures, then that would be one that goes. or if the just overall tax rates are decreased, then that makes it harder to find people who would benefit from the low-income housing tax credit. On the other hand, and it's like the Low-Income Housing Coalition has been a leader in talking about how there's huge tax incentives for higher income homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction, and if those resources were shifted around to more accurately match up with need, there's a possible benefit there. So these are things to keep talking about. Again, when you hear the news out of Washington, it seems like it's like all bad and it's all defense. And there is plenty of defense. We need to be brilliant defensive strategists this year. But there is, there's possibility that later in the year, some things could happen that provide opportunities to actually do some positive things.
Great, and we're going to come back to that discussion about the mortgage interest reduction. But switching over, we've been talking all about appropriations and spending bills and what happens on that side of it, but switching over to tax reform. So I think, Emily, you mentioned this. Right after the election, a lot of people said, oh my gosh, it's really real. Tax reform is going to happen now. We've got the Republican control of the House and the Senate, Republican president. It's going to happen. So hasn't happened yet. Questions about whether it is going to. So what do you think the prospects, the likelihood, and perhaps a little bit about timing if something is going to happen?
Yeah.
I want to hear this.
So before I answer this question, I just want to share a day I had a couple weeks ago where I had 5 meetings with 5 Senate Republican offices. So same party, same chamber, same day. I got 5 different answers.
Nice.
So we'll tell you what we know. I'm not gonna put odds on this, and I think anyone who does put odds on when or what's happening with tax reform, it's probably a pretty tough thing to do right now. So obviously, the main document out there we're working off of is the House blueprint, which came out last summer. That blueprint proposed eliminating most tax expenditures generally in order to lower corporate rates to 20%. It only retained one corporate tax expenditure explicitly, the research and development credit, and it was silent on most of the others. It explicitly repealed a few. We understand that the low-income housing tax credit was originally one of the ones that was going to be explicitly retained. They took it out at the last minute, but since then, the Republicans on the House committee have had a vote and determined there was sufficient support to retain the low-income housing tax credit and tax reform. So that's step one. There are many miles to go. So the administration, with much fanfare, put out their tax reform proposal a few weeks ago. It was 1 page. It was a reiteration of campaign principles: lower the corporate tax rate to 15%, repeal most credits and deductions. Theirs is less realistic than the House's plan, which many consider to be unrealistic. The House at least raises about $1 trillion through this controversial border adjustment proposal, which the administration's doesn't have. The estimates of the administration's proposal are between $3 and $7 trillion. And when you think about who in Congress is going to need to pass this thing, people who were elected in the Tea Party wave talking about deficit reduction, a $7 trillion tax plan, as much as many of them would like to cut taxes, is going to be a non-starter, not to mention if they want to do it through the budget reconciliation process where you can't raise deficits outside of a 10-year window. It's going to be really hard to fit that within the rules. So we're dealing with 2 very unrealistic tax reform proposals. The Senate hasn't put anything out yet. Their main role so far has been to kind of throw cold water on what the House is doing and to some extent the administration. Senate Finance Chairman Hatch is still talking about doing tax reform on a bipartisan basis, which would mean it would look completely different from what we've seen out of both the administration and the House. So each plan we've seen so far has significant obstacles just on its substance and then significant obstacles politically in dealing with the other chamber and administration. That said, given how poorly things have gone for Republicans on health care reform and the fact that in early 2018 it's already election year again, there's going to have to be something that the members can go home and campaign on when they go back to their states and districts. And that is it looks like something on taxes is what that is going to be. However, this whole idea of kind of cracking open the tax code, getting rid of, all of these very popular credits and deductions that entire industries have sprung up around, doing things that are hugely unpopular, like the border adjustment tax, which, Walmart and the Koch brothers are opposed to. It is very unlikely to look like that. A lot of people are starting to speculate that what we'll see is just tax cuts, something like the Bush tax cuts. They're temporary, but it's at least, a rate reduction. There may be some provisions with it, but this idea of, doing this 1986 style real tax reform looks less and less likely every day. So what that means for affordable housing, of course, worst case scenario is that, they actually do this 1986 style rewrite. They get rid of everything and the housing credit goes out the window. Again, I think that's very unlikely, especially given the fact that more than half of the House Ways and Means Committee supports the low-income housing tax credit. The kind of next level of threats is that the corporate rate is reduced low enough that it significantly impacts investment in the low-income housing tax credit, but there is no adjustment made to the credit to make sure that it's whole. Right now, our champions on the Hill are committed to not just protecting the program, but making sure we don't decrease our production in light of other changes in tax reform. So they're open to whatever changes might be needed to the credit to make sure that happens. But if those didn't happen, that could really undermine production as well. But then kind of moving off of the threats, there's some real opportunities in tax reform. There's legislation introduced in both the House and the Senate that in the case of the House would strengthen the low-income housing tax credit. In the case of the Senate, it would also expand it. We've got really strong bipartisan support on both of those. And kind of to my earlier point about how I think there's a lot of interest in just finding something that is truly bipartisan that members can really get behind. I think this is one of those things that, Republicans see that there's enough other Republicans in leadership positions, supporting this program that it gives them cover. And I think there's actually a decent chance that if something does move on tax reform, this legislation could be part of it. Senator Maria Cantwell, the lead in the Senate, has been talking for years about basically anything she sees moving that she can staple this bill onto. She is going to try her hardest. We have a tremendous champion in her. We have the support of both the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and the minority leader in the Senate. And so there's a decent chance that in light of all of these threats, that there may actually be some good outcomes for affordable housing this year.
Great. So this is the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which we have the slide up on the screen, which gives a very brief overview of it. Are there some provisions in that bill that would be of specific, because it's not only a bill in Senate to increase the cap, but it makes a number of tweaks to the program, we would call it. Are there some that are of particular interest to the supportive housing community?
Yeah, so the 50% increase in resources is obviously one of the kind of most exciting pieces of the legislation. The credit hasn't been meaningfully increased since 2000, and obviously affordable housing needs have grown. And considering that this credit is not only financing almost all new affordable housing production, but so much preservation being used in RAD, kind of shoring up, as HUD is having to do more with less, the credit is having to do more with the same amount. And so, this expansion is really critically needed. But beyond that, there's about 24 proposals in both the House and the Senate bill that would make it a stronger, more efficient, effective program. And before I get into a few that I think would help supportive housing specifically, I just kind of want to give some background on where these provisions came from. So the last time the House put out a major tax reform draft a few years ago under Chairman Camp, you may remember that the low-income housing tax credit was one of only 3 corporate tax expenditures that was retained, but they proposed a bunch of changes to the program, like getting rid of bonds, getting rid of the whole 4% side of the program, lengthening the credit period, which all told would have reduced the credit's production potential by about 60%. So we approached the committee saying, thank you for retaining the credit. We are so glad you recognize the value of this program, but what you've proposed is, just a lot of tremendously bad ideas. So they said, if you don't like what we came up with, what would you propose? So we spent, many of us here and our partners and spent, saying, okay, well, it is a 30-year-old program. What have we learned? And what would we propose, understanding that if anything does make it through tax reform, Congress is going to want to put its stamp on it. So we came up with this list, and some of them came from Senator Cantwell and Hatch themselves, who were also very involved in shaping this legislation. And I think at the end of it, some of the kind of broader themes are that not only would it increase resources, but it would help the credit work in more difficult to serve communities and with more difficult to serve populations like extremely low income tenants, which is where I think it can have the biggest impact for supportive housing, in that it kind of, in general, there's a number of provisions that help you use more credits per project. So, things like when we got the minimum 9% rate, which can help, you need less of the soft debt to make some of these projects pencil out. This would, provide things like that on the 4% side, and there's just a number of provisions, and I'll be a little bit more specific in a minute, that just make it so that these projects that are, more difficult to complete because you just need more resources for the population that you're serving, there's a number of ways you can get at that through this bill. So one of them is that it would provide a 50% basis boost for units that serve extremely low-income tenants. So right now, the most additional basis you can get for any type of project is 30%, so this would go a full 20% higher. And that's a provision that actually, Senator Cantwell, I know, is extremely passionate about. And so while we hope this whole package moves together, I would expect that if it does at any point, some provisions get passed piecemeal, I would expect that to be one. So the 50% increase for ELI households, I think, would be tremendously helpful. I mentioned the 9% floor. It would provide the 4% floor not only for the allocated credit, but for bond-generated credits, and it would allow states to give the 30% basis boost to bond finance properties. So especially here in New York, where so much of your housing credit development is done on the bond side, I know those bond provisions are especially impactful. One other that I wanted to highlight, I don't usually mention this provision because I think it's one that people are often least interested in, but I'm told this group will find it useful, is that it would change the housing credit student rule to align more closely with the HUD student rule, which is important for young people, foster youth, aging out of foster care. Right now, and I'm not an expert on the housing credit rule, so I'm hoping I capture this accurately, but right now, if you were a student at any point during the calendar year, you're considered a student and therefore ineligible for housing credit properties all year. So someone who graduated in May, if you're trying to get affordable housing in December, you might be told you can't because you're still a student. And of course, the idea of this provision was to make it so you're not using the housing credit to build dorms, but obviously there are these unintended consequences that updating the student rule would go a long way to address. So I think those are some of the key ones. There's a lot of stuff in the bill. I won't go through all of it, but if any of you haven't taken a look, we have a bill summary on the Action Campaign website, which is rentalhousingaction.org, and we tried to not just say what the provisions do, but since we did go through this extensive effort to really think about how to improve the program, we tried to provide the context for why each of these provisions is needed, and hopefully it gives you all the tools you need to help make the case for why these provisions are important.
Great. We have mentioned the Action Campaign, I feel like 5 or 6 times throughout the course of this discussion. You just mentioned it again as a resource and a website where people could find information. So could you talk a little bit about, sort of what the Action Campaign is and how you're doing it? And again, bringing it back to what we as advocates for affordable housing, even outside the credit, and I know you're one as well, what we could be doing to try to bring some of our resources together in the same way.
Yeah, so I appreciated all of the build-up for my, I finally get to talk about the Action Campaign. So the Action Campaign formed in 2009 after Fannie and Freddie pulled out of the housing credit market in the wake of the Great Recession, and all of these different housing credit advocates were going to the Hill with different messages. And congressional staff basically told us, you all need to figure out what you want as a housing credit industry, come back and speak to us with one voice. So for a while, it was focused on recovering from the recession in the housing credit market. Then we were really focused on, the threat of tax reform a few years ago, which doesn't really look like so much of a threat in hindsight. But we've always been talking about the need to protect the credit and tax reform. We were focusing for a while on making the minimum 9% rate permanent. But then kind of realizing we'd had a few bipartisan successes and that we had built really strong support for this program, we pivoted last year with the backing of Senator Marie Cantwell, who basically said, I think we should be doing more with this program. The 9% rate's great, but there's this need out there, and what more can we be doing? And so that's when we started launching this really bold agenda to not just protect the credit, not just strengthen it, but to expand it as well. And so, part of that has been growing the campaign, as we discussed. It's grown tremendously over the past few months. Part of it is really activating all of those new members. 2,000 is a lot of different groups, and they all represent, we've got huge national organizations. Some of our, they count as one member, but it's organizations like NARA, or the National Association of Home Builders, or NLIHC, who have, thousands of members around the country, and trying to get all of these groups to speak with one voice on behalf of the credit. And kind of going back to our previous point of what advocates can do, making sure everyone out in their states and districts is inviting members to properties, since it's important that we're all speaking with one voice on Capitol Hill, but what's more important is that we're able to make sure that every key member of Congress who's going to be weighing in on the tax reform discussion has people at home saying, we're not sending you back, well, maybe not threatening, but saying it is important as we consider your reelection that you support this program. This is something your district cares about. You might think of affordable housing as something only people in big cities care about, but this is why it's real in your your rural district or wherever they live. One example I thought was really compelling is some of the groups in Ohio that are part of this effort took Senator Portman out to see a facility or housing credit development that was geared towards helping people recovering from opioid addiction, which is an issue he's really passionate about, and obviously an issue that's really important to Ohio. So, connecting this affordable housing program to, another issue he cared about, and to Sarah's point, you can't make everyone care about affordable housing on its merits. We try, but often you have to make that connection. Is it health and housing? Is it housing and education? Whatever it is for that member, veterans, figuring out how we can connect those dots for them and show them why these housing tools are an important part of that.
Yeah, and is there anybody from Concern for Independent Living in the room? Yeah, I don't know if, I know Ralph Fasano had success in getting some members of Congress out to a beautiful facility that had been constructed for homeless veterans out on Long Island, and, same kind of thing. It wasn't necessarily that they were super interested in affordable housing, but they'd love to see what was going on with the veterans at that site. So I think there's definitely opportunity for that. And again, I think for those of you, this is a statewide organization, and for those of you particularly doing work outside of New York City, I think that's probably where, in terms of our congressional delegation, we still have some work to do. So shifting gears a little bit, Emily, Sarah, you have a different campaign to talk to us about a little bit. It's still in the context of the possibility of tax reform, but this one is called United for Homes. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about what that is all about?
Sure. So when I talked to you a little bit before about the budget, it's really important that when we're looking and fighting for these resources, that we realize that these are not the only resources that the federal government is spending on housing. And if you look at the broader context, you'll see that, at least from our perspective, that housing policy is really not prioritized well. Dollars are being spent in a way that really doesn't make a lot of sense. So if you look at all of the money that the federal government spends on housing, it's about $200 billion a year. 3/4 of that go to higher income households through things like the mortgage interest deduction and other homeownership tax benefits. So the mortgage interest deduction is a tax break that homeowners can get based on the size of their mortgage and therefore the amount of interest that they pay on their mortgage. And so you can imagine the larger the mortgage you have, the more benefit you get out of the tax break, and the higher incomes you have, the greater benefit you get as well. And in the face of a growing affordable housing crisis, where 1 in 4 people who are eligible for housing assistance get it, and the other 3 out of 4 get nothing, this doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of policy. So what we've proposed are some smart, modest reforms to the mortgage interest deduction. The idea is to expand its reach so that more low and moderate income homeowners can benefit. Currently they don't, or many of them don't. But also to generate savings that we can reinvest into solutions that we know work, that are highly targeted to where the need is. And so those 2 changes are, 1, we want to see lowering the size of a mortgage that's eligible. So currently, a home up to $1 million is eligible for the mortgage interest deduction. We want to see that brought down to the first $500,000 of a loan. So that impacts New York more than in other places, but it's still pretty generous. It really only impacts about 6% of loans nationwide that are above $500,000. And that means even if you have a mortgage at $600,000, you would still get a tax break on the first $500,000 of it. The second piece is converting it from a deduction to a credit. So right now, 70% of taxpayers don't itemize their taxes. That includes renters, but that also includes half of all homeowners. They don't itemize their taxes, and because they don't itemize, they don't get the mortgage interest deduction. And so turning it into a credit means that everyone who owns a home would be eligible for a tax break. We estimate that 25 million more homeowners would see a greater tax break than they currently do, and that includes about 15 million homeowners who currently get zero from the mortgage interest deduction. The two of those together actually produce a whole lot of savings, and that's because you're really seeing the savings at the highest end of the income spectrum. We want to see those savings, it's about $241 billion over 10 years, be reinvested into really highly targeted rental housing programs. That could be something like rental assistance, a renter's tax credit, housing choice vouchers, the housing trust fund. There are lots of really good options that are out there. We're not prescriptive about what that needs to be, other than it needs to be as targeted as possible. And now that tax reform is really gearing up, we've been talking about this for 10 years or more, many years. We're really ramping up our efforts, and we've been working with both Republicans and Democrats on this. A lot of Republican offices are interested in this for a couple of reasons. One, many of their constituents don't see any mortgage interest deduction dollars, and that's because a lot of Republicans live in suburban or rural areas. Their home values are less there. That means very few people have a mortgage that's big enough that's making them eligible for the mortgage interest deduction. You really see most of the dollars going to California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, those big high-cost cities and states. Those are also the states that have some of the highest affordable housing needs, and that their resources are being spent on higher income homeowners in those states and not on the people who need it the most. So we're reaching out to Republicans on this, we're reaching out to Democrats on this. We're really hopeful that we can see something on this, and we've already started to see some changes proposed already. The president put out his broad plan for tax reform that doesn't directly touch on the mortgage interest deduction, but includes some indirect changes to it. What it would do is raise the standard deduction. So when people have a choice between taking the standard deduction or itemizing, this would mean far more people would end up taking the standard deduction, which is a good thing. They would see a greater tax break by doing that. Otherwise, they would continue to choose to itemize their taxes. About 25 million more homeowners would take the standard deduction instead of taking the itemized deduction. And that would really mean that the mortgage interest deduction would really be left to the top 5% of households. So only the very wealthy and only those in very, very high housing markets with high mortgages would still be eligible for the mortgage interest deduction. And what we've been telling members of Congress to do is if they want to go ahead with raising the standard deduction, they should also pair it with some sort of reforms that really get at that high end and rein in how regressive the mortgage interest deduction is. Part of the reason why a lot of progressives like this, like Keith Ellison, he's put out a bill that would do the same thing, that would make those sorts of changes, is because we know that the mortgage interest deduction really fuels income inequality and the racial wealth gap. That's because the people who tend to benefit from these programs are higher income white households in wealthier neighborhoods. The people who are left out are those renters who are going without rental assistance. And those tend to be lower income, more people of color, and communities of color that are not benefiting. There's a really great piece in the New York Times by Matthew Desmond. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and sociologist. He just wrote Evicted, which was very popular and it's making the rounds on the Hill. Did a really great piece in the New York Times about how this policy that was never really intended to promote homeownership has kind of been hijacked by industry groups. They say that it promotes homeownership, but it really doesn't. And there's a whole industry really trying to protect it through tax reform. Our job is to try to go in there and mix things up a little bit and hopefully get more resources for affordable housing and work across the aisle to do that.
Right, and the real message being not just mortgage interest reduction reform, but that any resources coming from that stay in housing and go to target people with lower incomes or greater need.
Absolutely. Republicans might be interested in this because that huge amount of savings, that $241 billion, will help them underwrite their tax cuts that Emily had talked about earlier, with their plan to have tax cuts or reform. They need to find resources to do it. We're hoping that your senator, I know Senator Schumer is not supportive of reforming the mortgage interest deduction. I understand that. Our hope is to put enough pressure on him through advocates across his state to tell him that even if he doesn't support it, Plan B, once Republicans start moving on it, needs to be about recapturing those savings and keeping housing dollars within housing. We have an affordable housing crisis across his state, across many states, and we can't let these resources go towards lower tax rates for corporations or high-income individuals.
Great. Well, we have a few minutes left, and we've covered a lot of ground. Questions from the audience on any of the topics we've covered? Yes, Simon?
Regarding the sort of targeting of mortgage interest reduction as an avenue for opening up resources for affordable housing, how do you guys determine that that was a good way to go? Because it seems like going all the way back to '86, that was the one sort of sacrosanct deduction that Reagan didn't even touch. It seems like this much farther along, it's sort of that much more in the national conscience as being, the right of home ownership and almost, democracy, right?
Yeah, so I don't know if people in the back could hear the question. It was about we recognize that we face headwinds in looking at the mortgage interest reduction. How do you deal with the fact that even in 1986, last tax reform, it wasn't touched? So how do you answer some of that, or why look at that as a resource?
Well, things have really changed since 1986 in terms of how people are seeing the mortgage interest deduction. It is really no longer that third rail that politicians are afraid to touch anymore. You're seeing economists from across the spectrum, ideological spectrum, saying that this is really a wasteful use of dollars. Because it's going to so many of the highest income households, it really doesn't promote home ownership. It's promoting debt. It's promoting high income households to take on even bigger mortgages than they would otherwise do. And so what you're seeing is, what I've been hearing, at least on the Hill, is there's a lot of interest among Republicans and Democrats who say, if we're looking at tax reform and looking at how we're spending dollars, we should make sure that those dollars are as targeted to the need as possible. And I think that there's interest in going there because more people are aware of what bad policy it is, and people are more sensitive to issues of income inequality and racial inequity that they maybe in the 80s it wasn't on the radar as much as it should have been. So I think it's prime time for progressives to really be pushing this and pushing their members of Congress to walk the walk of what they're talking about. And I think there's a practical reason why Republicans are looking at it. Like I said, their constituents aren't getting the money, and they also don't like federal dollars going to places where it's not effective.
Yeah, and again, I thought the Michael Desmond piece was excellent. It was in the Sunday Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago. And what was effective about it, I thought, is that it talked about these as both, the rental assistance in Section 8 particularly, and the mortgage interest deduction as both being they're prongs of federal housing policy. And whereas people typically think of them as like completely separate, like one's an assistance program for low-income people and the other is a tax benefit that we provide to create home ownership, that's how a lot of people have traditionally thought about it, but they're really both how the federal government's choosing to spend its money and how it's impacting the housing market. So
and
definitely worth looking at that article.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like the average benefit of somebody who's in the top 1% is $9,000 a year. The average benefit of somebody who's earning $50,000 is $500. And when you look at that, we're not even calling for eliminating the mortgage interest deduction like some folks have been doing. We're talking about small changes on the margin that could free up billions of dollars that we could reinvest where it's really needed. So I think now really is the time, especially with tax reform happening. This is the time to be pushing members of Congress to really look at what is good policy for their constituents, what's good policy in terms of taxpayer dollars, what's effective. And if they're willing to do that when it comes to other programs, I think they're going to be willing to do it on the tax side too.
Yeah, but certainly cognizant of the opposition, too. There's very strong political opposition on the other side, so, but that's what makes for good, interesting policy debates. Other questions? Yes, hey, Stephen.
Steve Isaac from the Support Housing Network. These are some of our key national partners. You all, if you're members of ours, have gotten emails from me saying sign on to the action campaign, for example. So do it.
Or you don't get invited back next year.
But more specifically, when you sign on, you're friends of our friends for the foreseeable future. So I'm asking the panel to talk a little bit about the new, like all the tools that you've developed to generate really grassroots responses to our issues.
Okay, well, I can start with some of what's on the action side. I think the tool that people use the most is we have fact sheets showing the impact of the low-income housing tax credit in every state and congressional district, not just the number of homes that it's created, but the jobs that it's supported through the development, the economic impacts that it's generated. Again, kind of on that point that you can't always get people to care about affordable housing per se, but maybe they'll care about having 100,000 jobs that have been created in their district because of the affordable housing being built. We also highlight all of the affordable housing needs that still remain in each state using data from NLIHC. So I think every member of Congress loves to see things that are really specific to just the people they represent. So we try to provide that on the housing credit. We also have all the tools to make the case for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, the bill summary that I mentioned. We have sample letters to your members of Congress where we'll link to the congressional directory and have the whole email where you just kind of fill out your field. It's like a Mad Lib, and try to make it really simple for you to reach out and request co-sponsorship on the bills. We have a lot of videos, guides for hosting property events. So if you've never invited a member of Congress to a property before, it can be kind of an intimidating process. We try to provide guides for where to start. So certainly encourage you all to check it out if you haven't already. Again, it's rentalhousingaction.org.
So we put out a lot of data that folks seem to find really helpful. So district level, county level data on your housing needs, and where that need is most seen in terms of income levels. We're putting out a new report next week called Out of Reach, which tracks the amount of money a renter would need to earn hourly at their job in order to afford an apartment in the area. That's always upsetting to see. So that's out there too, and lots more resources on our website. You saw the report that we put out in Toolkit. But also you can check out unitedforhomes.org where we have data about what those changes would mean on the state level and how many new units of housing you could see with reinvestment.
Yeah, and we're focusing a lot on appropriations as we tend to. People can go on our website and find help with exactly how to approach members of Congress, sample emails, sample letters, scripts for phone calls, and we tend to run a number of sort of mini campaigns over the course of the appropriations year, and it very much designed to hit people in Congress with the messages they need at the point they are in the process. So sign up for our advocacy alerts. Steve is always very good at sending those along as well. So there's lots of ways. I mean, I think the point for all of us is there's lots of ways to get involved this year. We feel like one impact of the election is that there's a lot of hunger on the part of people to really sort of take this stuff on. And so I would encourage people, like, get with, not only yourself, but get with people in your community, find people who are looking for ways to have a voice on this and use these tools to let people know. And I mean, of course, in New York, we're dealing with a lot of Democrats, and I think there's sometimes people are represented by Democrats under this situation say, oh, they're already on board already, so I don't really need to talk to them. But trust me, the Democrats, and I'm particularly thinking about your senator who's now the lead Democrat in the Senate where they need those 60 votes, and so he's sort of in the position of being the, only thing standing between us and oblivion, maybe. And there will be lots of people asking Senator Schumer to rescue them from bad things. I mean, there's proposals that I think most people in this room would probably strongly disagree with on immigration, on climate change, on environmental quality, on health, on civil rights, on taxes, and on Russia. And the stuff about funding for help for poor people has to rise to the top there. I mean, this thing about, they need 60 votes so the Democrats can just stop anything, it's not that simple. Senator Schumer has to keep his caucus together, keep everybody on board, keep people who are going to be facing election in 2018 in Republican states from having to worry about what they're going to talk about when they're not. You need to help him by making sure he knows how important these housing issues are to people in New York, and to make that a priority. He'll want to help, he'll know how to help, but he's going to have to make some very tough decisions over the course of this year, and needs to hear that housing, if housing is a priority, that's helpful to all of you.
Great. I would also just add one more kind of concrete thing that you all can help with, which I think whenever people get a sign-on letter, sometimes there's this sort of, tragedy of the commons of like, how much do I really need to sign on? How much do I really need to forward this to my network? But, the Action Campaign, we've got 2,000 members, more than 100 of them are from New York, which is awesome. And, personal thanks to many of you in this room who I know helped build those numbers. We have one member in Wyoming. So, do we need to be going into Schumer's office to talk about the low-income housing tax credit? Not very often, unless we're going in to thank him every 3 months, which we do. But, when we go to talk to Wyoming members who we really need to get on this bill, or, Utah, or, some of these other red states where we just don't have as many partners, that's one where just forwarding these things to your networks or your, friends, colleagues in some of these states, because every time we go into a member's office, we say, I'm here on behalf of Enterprise, but we also lead the Action Campaign. Here are the other, 100 organizations I'm representing in this state. And it makes a much stronger case when we can build those up. So I know that, there's sign-on letters and all of these different programs, but they really do all make a difference, and they really, have a much bigger impact when we go in to advocate for these programs.
And then just to add on, you have a number of, it might not feel like it, but your Republicans in the state are very moderate compared to other parts of the country. They are often put into a position where they are going to be the ones deciding whether or not they vote along with their more conservative colleagues, or if they push back. And so you guys have two really unique situations. One with Schumer, where you have a lot of leverage there. And then one is with your more moderate Republican members. If you put enough pressure on them, they might also be willing to weigh in with their leadership in the House to pull back on some of the plans that are in their health care bill, for example. We saw that happen, or in the appropriations bills or others. So I wouldn't give up on them either. They're a really important voice right now on the Hill.
Yeah, and Tom Reed is on the Ways and Means Committee and has not yet signed on to the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. So it'd be great if you heard from some of you after this conference.
Yep. Great. Well, with that, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. I think there's about a 20-minute break before the next panel starts. So thank you again for your attention and for joining us.